My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that I give them in a shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Today I have for you a swap cast between Generation Zed and I. I'm a little late, but Dave only put out the free half of this conversation, this 1 hour or so. Well, I'm putting out the whole thing right here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast just for you guys. It's our 1-year anniversary week, and next week is my birthday. Tomorrow is the 100th day that Tara and I have lived together. So a lot's going on this week. I'm super excited. A lot of love, a lot of good vibes from my family, my friends, and most importantly, my lovely girlfriend. Everything's going great. And we're going to be at the 500th episode of Tinfoil Hat, folks. But before that, enjoy this week of podcasting. I'm going to put out 4 new episodes this week just for you guys for the 1-year anniversary. So go and show us some love, pay us back for this hard work on the Patreon, patreon.com/MFTIC, and be on the lookout for a new series of podcasts between Generation Zed and myself. We're calling it the Elemental Philosophorum, where we break down everything conspiratorial, spiritual, and just plain interesting about the periodic table of elements. A lot of alchemy at work. All right, folks, enjoy this conversation with Generation Zed, and thank you for sticking with us here. The My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, 1-year anniversary this week. October 5th was when the first episode came out, and in just 1 year, we've hit 100,000 downloads. We're past that now, thanks to you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your support. Make sure you're following us on Instagram, on Rockfin. Join the family on Patreon. If you're in the $33 tier, you get a book sent to you from my library of over 600 esoteric books. So sign up on the Patreon. Don't miss out, folks. Thanks for listening. Enjoy this conversation with Generation Zed. When we look at cymatics and we look at how electricity and vibration and pattern and like all of these things fit together in a syncretic way, I think, just like animals have different abilities, conscious beings such as humans are in a different class and have their own specialty and ability. And because of this earth that we're on, we forget our soul's, path, our true celestial nature, our real connection. And when we dream, we sort of, and I'm really unsure about this, but I think it's a really fascinating thing to explore. Is like, what is a dream? Where are you going? Is that your soul leaving your body? I just talked to a guy who astral projected and does it frequently, and there's a lot of really amazing things that he's learned and come back with from those journeys. And I think that's something that spiritual people have done for thousands of years.
is all the resources of the entire future history of our species coming available to us a millisecond after we invent this kind of a device. It is a perfect and extreme example of what I call the forward escape. It's essentially a siren. We're building a siren which calls the resources of future humanity millions and millions of years in the future into the late 20th century or early 21st century historical situation. And it does it without the intervention of flying saucers, without the violation of natural law.
The following is a conversation with Mark from the My Family. We have a very special guest with us today. Mark from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Mark, brother, thank you so much for coming on, sir.
Thank you for having me, bro. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited. I've listened to your show a little bit today, and I'm really impressed. So I'm hoping to live up to the caliber of quality of information that you constantly strive to put out. I think it's really good.
Well, first off, thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. But just to start off the conversation, I mean, what got you into the whole, sort of, I guess you could say truth seeking. I don't want to put a connotation to it, but truth seeking experience. And again, not just podcasting, but the community. Being so involved as you are and helping as many people as you do and going out of your way to assist people without any, financial reward, at least. What got you into all of that?
Well, on the latter part of what you just said, I'm very confident in value for value, so even though the cooperative is pretty much, all above board, nobody's paying anything to be a part of it. There is a value that I gain from having it and being a part of it. And yeah, there's going to be more and more as far as the community goes and my involvement in it. I've actually always been sort of a introspective kind of guy. I was the captain of my wrestling team, but for the most part, before that moment, I was kind of like, to myself. I had friends, I had, moments where I was like the class clown. But I had always been very independent when I was a young guy. And that led me to study the things that I was interested in. Because at the same time of being independent from the peers, I also felt very independent from the influence from the school and the church and the different, people that were trying to shape my reality. And I didn't excel very well in high school, which made me kind of unmotivated to get to college. But around that time, cannabis, smoking every day, I don't want to put it all on that because I think people can totally achieve everything I've achieved without the help of cannabis. But I would say, reading, just like, it's just going to sound weird, but nature books led me to, as a kid, to go further and further and further. And like, history always seemed boring, but as I got older, history became more and more interesting. And now I love reading about, what's gone on, excuse me, 100, 200, 300 years ago, in my own area, especially because I feel like there is this sort of, as it's been described to me through Jose Arguelles and David Icke, different authors who talk about time, you know, we don't actually live on a timeline. You know, that's just how we perceive history. We try to think of it in that linear fashion, but
Right.
the more I look into it, the less I think there's anything linear about it. And I was explaining it to my girlfriend the other day in this way. It's like, we need to understand what's going on in the past to help us better understand the context of what we're dealing with right now. So that's where I'm at now. How I got to this point, just always feeling like a rebel. There's something inside me that was a little bit like rebellious and wanted to question people, and that got me accused of being a smart ass and all the other things that my
Right.
grandparents would say for questioning, their conservative values. And that made me seem very like liberal to them, but then I kind of switched and was like, well, burn it all down. And with Trump, and not to go into the political tangent, but my whole life I had been very interested in changing the world for the better,
Right.
caring about others in that expanded way, which seems like, in hindsight, like, well, what am I going to do? I'm no more special than you or anyone else to change the world. So I didn't feel like, oh, I was called to do something, but that I knew what that was. It was kind of on the
Right.
precipice. And I think in our own unique ways, we all get called to that. And my point of bringing up the politics thing is I felt like no matter what side you took, it was all a form of social engineering. I didn't know what that term was back then, but it really felt that way. And I dropped out of college because the sociology class, I remember like the first week of my sophomore year of college, I was like, this is sociology? I'm like, this is social engineering. Like they're just trying to, get us to go, yes, 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 to, this kind of corporate, pilgrim-esque immigrant colony mindset. That's just maybe the way I labeled it then. But I've always been very passionate about nature, and why that connects to history is because somebody who's really close friends with my father is an indigenous American from this area, Connecticut, United States. And just knowing him, he wasn't like some fountainhead of wisdom, but just knowing him had an impression on me when I was a kid. And I always felt like, Indians, there's something there. Why do we call them Indians? Why do we call them
Right.
Native Americans? What's going on? So, and also like the whole cliche of like spirit animals and them having like totems and, having a really deep connection with the earth, which is not cliche, it's very true. But I think people's understanding of that is very superficial. So
Right.
I've more and more gotten interested in this stuff, and two people who recently have really expanded my understanding of these events that unfolded before America was formed the way it is now are Ross Ben and Michael Wan. Now, Michael Wan is a Susquehanna alchemist, and Ross Ben wrote a book called Great Mystery Philadelphia. Really, really interesting book. And then his companion book is Free Your Mind, Free Your Mound, and Your Mind Will Follow. So,
Wow.
I was just an average dude delivering Amazon packages for the man, slaving away.
Right.
And I was listening to guys like Ross Ben and Michael Wan, just like as this journey has unfolded, my instincts, my intuition, they point me in certain directions. Certain
Right.
people come, podcasts, episodes, even if it's just one episode of a podcast, or if it's like Sam Tripoli show, I've listened to every single episode,
Right.
and that's part of, we'll get to that a little later on if we do, but that's part of, I think, the foundation of learning that I created for myself in this kind of freelance, no guarantees way, where I'm just like learning about all this stuff and taking it in. And, the way Sam and I hooked up, it was so strange. I go to a show, I give him a copy of the Kabbalion, You know, this is a book that I bought back when I was a kid, just smoking weed and trying to figure out the universe, figure out what is God. I knew the
Right.
Catholic Church in my hometown was all wrong, you know, and I felt like there might be something in like ancient Egypt. There might be something in ancient Greece. You know, I heard about the secret wisdom schools that were in Greece. You know, I read this book, Secret History of the World, when I was pretty young, and that was like, oh, okay, this is starting to make sense. Everybody's telling the same story. They're just using their own language to tell it, you know, or their
Their
own
own
cultural.
perception. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So those things started coming into the fray, and like Joseph Campbell archives, I listened to that. Manly P. Hall, you know, read a lot of his work. Rudolf Steiner, read a lot of his work. And as I'm learning all of this stuff, I always found a job where I could read. Like I was a delivery guy for a Chinese food place, and in between deliveries, I would read. And then I had a job at Whole Foods. Not a great opportunity to read, but on my lunch breaks, I would read.
Right.
Then I found podcasts, and it was like, wow, okay, let me go back to that delivery job I had where I was free with my mental energy. I could listen to music. Didn't really have podcasts back then. I was like out of high school, but I
Sorry, how many years ago was this? Just to give people some context.
oh well, I personally didn't have podcasts back then. Podcasts did exist. I just wasn't aware of them.
Got you.
This was in 2012. So
Okay. Okay.
2013, 2012, this is around when I graduated high school, and I really started opening my mind to all this stuff. And it was like 6 or 7 years later of learning and studying, just as things came to me, that I was like fully into podcasts. And I had a YouTube show, and I went to see Sam one day, gave him the Kabbalion, like I said. Sorry, going off a little
No,
tangent
no, no.
today.
Please, please. No,
But
no worries,
I
brother.
think there's some through line that we'll see here. So I give Sam the Kabbalion, not expecting anything, just with the hopes that he'll read it and have a higher spiritual awareness, because I felt like he had guests on the show who had touched on it, but just didn't really like hit it out of the park like I had hoped. And I was thinking, well, if he has this book, then maybe that could point him in the right direction to find someone who could talk about this.
That's smart.
This was,
I got to give that to you, brother. That's smart.
and well, thank you. And it wasn't, you know, it was just like, hey, I'm a fan of this guy. I want him to have this. And, you know, it ended up being a really good foot in the door to go on his show, because I talked to him on his Patreon, and I was like, hey, I'm the guy that gave you that book. Did you read it? And
Right.
he was like, you know, yeah, come on the Patreon and talk about it. One thing led to another. I'm driving this girl. Sorry, I'm trying to light this blunt over here.
No problem at all,
I'm
man.
driving this girl she's from Egypt, of all places. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So we met through Yale, not a student, never gone to Yale, but I was a bakery delivery guy on the in town. So I would deliver within Yale campus, and I ended up going to this sort of art studio for a couple months before the virus happened, right? And
Right.
and it was strange because of that, this girl who lives in Egypt now, she got stuck here in America for an extra couple months. So here I am, just like a single dude trying to spend some time with a good looking chick. I took her up to like a lake in Connecticut. You know, I'm like, she's from Egypt. She's never seen something like this, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And she ends up, we were pretty good friends, and she ends up asking me to give her a ride to the airport in Virginia, which is like a 10-hour drive from where I live. And I've never been that far south before. And this was like 3 months into the pandemic. So I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, I'll drive. There's probably not going to be any traffic. Everybody's afraid to go anywhere, you know? And there wasn't. It was beautiful. Just, you know, trucks and maybe a couple people. But I've been driving for at least 10 years, and I've never seen the roads that clear. Total side note, either way.
Wow.
So I ended up driving her totally coincidentally to the Dulles airport. you know what that is. I
Yeah.
know what that is.
Yes.
Right. So here I am, a guy who's only done like 2 Patreon podcasts that nobody's seen with Sam Tripoli. You know, nobody's special, just another dude listening to podcasts and interested in this stuff. And I end up having this rare opportunity to drive someone from Egypt to the Dulles airport. So I'm like, okay.
Sorry, brother. Could you just give some context about Dulles, just to our audience, for those who might not know? Just a brief.
Yeah. Alan Dulles is definitely a shady guy in my book. He's behind a lot of the foundational work that went into creating the CIA. I think he was around when it was the OSS, and then created some of what we now know to be the CIA. And he was also in a sort of love triangle with somebody who was very close with Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, famous psychoanalyst, you know, very influential with his work in psychology. This guy, Alan Dulles, was using Carl Jung, you know, as a sort of unwitting mentor. You know, he was getting all this psychology information from Carl Jung not knowing, you know, what he was actually, who he was providing with this valuable information. But
Right.
that's maybe a tangent, but it helps you understand like what they're actually doing. Yeah, maybe people have the perspective, oh well, they're just defending our country. Give me a break, you know, like they're trying to mind control people. And if that's limited to just our enemies, well, that's great. But you know, I don't believe that
Just as a quick side,
you know, is
right. Just as a quick side note, if you had to put a rough percentage, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever, how much on a percentage basis, based on what you've read, what you've seen, you know, the people you've interviewed, things like that, and you've spoken to, how much, as a quick side thing, because I think the audience will enjoy this, how much do you think the CIA is genuinely, like, how many of their, I guess you could say, missions or objectives within their agenda are actually to help the people of the West for safety, and how much do you think is simply create the problem, create the solution somewhere in the world, and then just go dominate? Like, how, if you had to, you know what I mean, if you had to ratio it?
I wouldn't even, I mean, it would be totally on the latter side of things, but I would even maybe be kind of a correction here and say,
Sure.
like, it's not so much that there's like, hey, let's get together and be the best. It's like they've always been the best, and they've constantly evolved to maintain that spot in the best. And I'm not, you know, valuing that position by using the word best, but you know, if we're looking at the control structure, they're the best at controlling, you know.
Well, that's
they're
why
part of the wing of it.
Right. Very quickly, if I could say, that's also why the CIA has their own drug department, because they feel they can do a better job than the DEA. The CIA, it seems like whoever you compare it to, whether it has to do with space, whether it has to do with weather, whether it has to do with, you know, covert missions, they always seem to be, you know, like the big, no pun intended, the big brother. Like, you know, the DEA can't do what we do. The NSA can't do what we do, you know, like.
Right. And that's indicative of who they're ultimately supporting. It's you know, elite bloodline royal families that were behind the federal shift in this country and created the Federal Reserve and all the other wings of the federal government that I don't think are constitutional. But speaking of Constitution, I mean, so the Dulles Airport, CIA, not an expert on that, but I would definitely turn to some of your older episodes, because I'm sure you've covered this topic many times.
Thank you. Yeah.
And so I drop her off, you know, kind of a sad departure. She's a really nice person. You know, that feeling when you meet someone internationally and then they go back to their other country, and it's like, how long is this going to last? But
right.
It's great. You know, it was a great opportunity to drive down there. And I'm like, and I'm sorry, my headphones just fell over here.
No worries.
And I'm like, you know, well, traffic's not bad. Washington, D.C. must be evacuated and empty. So I went and I explored the geomancy in Washington, D.C., right? So for those who aren't familiar, Washington, D.C. is at the end of what's called the Chesapeake Bay, right? It's on the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the Chesapeake Bay is the mouth of the Susquehanna River. So for those who are familiar with Michael Wan's work, you'll know that the Susquehanna River's pretty important to the story in a sort of unconventional way, as far as we know. Conspiracy theories to be usually, geographical landscape features don't really play a huge part in conspiracies traditionally. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
so for the, person who's new to all this stuff, you might be like, how is this taking a turn into like rivers? What do rivers have to do with anything? Well,
Right.
rivers have always been an extremely important source of life, from fishing to hunting to just boating. I mean, boating before vehicles, as we know them, were invented. Boats were the only way to efficiently travel faster than you could with a horse or, feet, and
Of
travel
course.
very far over the oceans and whatnot. So,
Right.
rivers, oceans, coastlines, humans settle there. It's just for thousands of years, you'll see there's archaeological evidence that supports this. There's physical evidence to this day that supports this. Just go to any beach. It won't be too far from a house, most likely.
Right.
People like to live by the water. It's part of being human. So I go to Washington, D.C., see the sites, look at the big obelisk, this massive, like, piece of stone sort of magnetically anchoring the energy in this place.
Right.
And it's not accidental. Washington, D.C., as many people know, like, they created the country before they decided that was going to be the capital. So they had a pretty large amount of time, 10 to 15 to even 20 years of planning this, city. And it's absolutely a geomantic spell. So what do I mean by that? Using certain celestial alignments, they're able to calculate north, they're able to calculate where the sun sets and rises, and they're also able to calculate, where the certain constellations will predictably be. So with all that knowledge and the knowledge of land, they were able to create almost an active spell with stone, the sky, and the land, and the
Sorry,
stone in between.
did your reading of nature books have anything to factor in to this? Like, was there a point where you had said to yourself after reading those nature books, was there one particular point, or did it take a certain time to read, Michael Wan's books and others to say, like, wow, there's a significance in rivers, and to, realize that arguably we're living in many different variations of a matrix, if you want to call it? Was there a certain point in time? I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just I figured it would flow well.
It does. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to elaborate on that. I would say my love of nature has always pushed me to look at the world a different way, because it's pretty obvious, if you have that perspective, that our society doesn't honor, respect, or take care of nature in a uniform way.
Right.
You have some places here and there who do a great job, but that's a
Yeah.
very small, very small portion of what's really going on the earth. Now, the earth is very large, and also I believe the earth is very powerful and can reset itself, and has its own ability to heal itself in the same way our bodies do. But, just like our bodies can be overwhelmed by a toxin or a disease or something, an ailment that could, mean the end of our lives, I think the earth might, have that sort of programmed into it to reset before that happens.
Right.
And that's getting super woo. Can't prove that. This is all just a thought experiment for those who are more logically minded, but that's what my intuition has always pointed me towards. And I think having a love for nature and just like a reverence for that has kind of guided me to look at things differently and connect with my higher self. Like, I was always against drugs and alcohol and all that stuff. And for whatever reason, I decided to smoke weed when I was 16. And again, not trying to be an advocate for pot here, because everybody's got to make their own choice. But I definitely think that was what I needed as an individual to sharpen my intuition, my interest, and then hone it in and have the ability to focus. I mean, with all the distractions like video games and internet and TV, all the things I grew up around, being someone who graduated in 2012, born in 94, cannabis really brought me back to what I think it means to be an organic human being connected with your mind, body, and soul. And from that perspective, I'm more able to understand the world around me and also discern whether or not somebody like Michael Wan or Ross Ben is a valuable mentor to me. And I think that's all based on intuition. So no, rivers, as significant as they have been in my life, didn't I didn't understand it, at all until I started seeing Michael Wan's work. But then in a sort of reverse time sort of way, I started to make these connections. For example, today I'm reading from this book right here, Spirit in the Stone. And I bought this book in Woodstock, New York. And I bought it because it talks about something called the Hamanasset line. And this is supposedly a ley line where there are several stone alignments, and it even tracks the celestial equinox, I think the summer solstice and the winter solstice, as well as the fall. It's basically like a living compass, a standing compass. So you have a rock on Montauk Point that connects all the way to this island in Ontario, off the lake, I think Lake Ontario.
Sorry, is this Ontario, California, or Ontario, Canada?
Canada.
Okay.
And it has there's an island called Manitou, Manitou Island, and this Hamanasset line, crosses through there. So I'm like, that's interesting, because I'm trying to think like, how does Connecticut play into this? Michael Wan, Ross Ben, they're studying Philadelphia, Susquehanna River, none of which is in Connecticut. So I'm like, I'm from Connecticut. How do I fit into this? So I start re-examining my life in a way and trying to okay, well, the Housatonic River comes from here to there. It goes to my hometown. That's where I was born, so either way, the connection that was relevant today was Hunter Mountain. A year ago, almost exactly a year ago, before I met my girlfriend, who I'm now with, and went to Woodstock to get this book a couple months ago, I was in Woodstock by myself, just driving around, following my intuition. One of the practices that I was taking on, I think everybody should do this in their life, is just go for a spirit ride. Get in your car with no destination, try to have some gas and, maybe even limit yourself on time, but just drive and find somewhere that maybe you've never been before. And that day I happened to be near the New York, Connecticut border. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to drive into New York and see where I end up. And I ended up near Woodstock, of course. Look at my background here, maybe the hippie vibes. But it is very corporate, it's not as mystical as someone like me would like. So I drove around and I moved on, and I just kind of drove through the countryside. Well, I happened to see a mountain called Hunter Mountain, and I took a picture of it. No reason, just whatever. Cool mountain, great view from where I had been parked. But it just dawned on me, take a picture of that. Sorry. I posted that on Instagram, and that was it. Now, a year later, today, I'm looking in this book that, again, I had bought in Woodstock, and I only bought it because it mentioned Connecticut. So I'm like, cool. But I didn't, I didn't go through it all the way. Now, going through it a little further, I find that, this Hunter Mountain is a sacred site that's lined up on the Hamanasset line. So I had recognized that intuitively, and now I'm piecing it together in this kind of way. Another example of that, Michael Wan, had him on my podcast. Episode 25 was a great podcast. We hit it off. He invited me, he's like, oh, if you're ever in the area, come by, just visit me at my place. I'm like, wow, great. And I happened to have that opportunity. I drove to Indiana at the beginning of this year. And on my way there, I called him up. I said, hey, man, I'm near the Susquehanna River. What should I check out? And he's like, well, you got to go here. So I start driving there and I see a sign, and people on the East Coast know what I'm talking about. I don't know how far into the United States these signs go, but you'll see these blue signs typically in New York, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut, and they're historical markers, and they're usually blue and gold or blue and white, blue and black, but blue for the most part, sometimes red.
Right.
And they have, on this day, this thing happened here in this place. So I'm in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and I see a sign that says in 1626, a Connecticut colony came, people from Connecticut had come to that exact spot, however many years ago. So I'm like, that's weird, and then I go to the spot that Michael told me to check out. Interesting, not too significant. Couldn't really get to the Susquehanna River in that town because the banks are really high, so it just wasn't like we didn't want to like bushwhack down to the river.
Now, sorry, just curious, what does Michael propose? Is there a form of energy, a form of if you were to do some type of, I don't want to say ritual, but some type of energetic practice of sorts, would it be more prominent within that particular location? And what's the significance of these? Because there's clearly a significance geographically, but energetically, frequentially, do you feel anything when you go there? Do you feel a difference compared to walking on a regular street, relative to being up in that mountain?
So I can't speak for Mike, and I think if I could, he would say something along these lines. It's different for everybody. And why I'm going to say that is because, and bear with me because I didn't really, I'm kind of going a little all over the place here, but so I didn't elaborate as much as I should have. When I went to Washington, D.C., I had to go home afterwards. I was only there for 20, 30 minutes. I probably got a coffee and left, right? So went to Whole Foods, I'm pretty predictable. So I go through Pennsylvania, actually through Maryland first, and I'm about to go through Pennsylvania. No rush, had nothing to do that day. And I had the whole day ahead of me. And I'm like, well, I've heard all this stuff about the Susquehanna River. Let me go check it out. So I drive into Pennsylvania, and I'm on the west side of the Susquehanna River, sort of near York, Pennsylvania, Red Lion, Pennsylvania, just driving through. And personally, from my personal experience, having sage, having tobacco, having cannabis, having some sort of offering, that's a way to pray. So for me, that information kind of comes from a mentor of mine who I met back when I was in community college. It taught me a lot about Native American culture. So from my perspective, standing on the bank of the river, speaking from my heart and expressing, where I was in that moment, and maybe even praying for what I wanted to happen or for what I want to happen. And typically when I'm in that moment, my prayers usually go towards helping others, helping the little ones, helping the animals and the plants of this world. And I think, just having that thought, there's something energetic about that. So I connected with the river in that way, in a faith, in an energy way, because one thing I learned through this guy named Mike Santana, I think he was on the Higher Side Chats talking about like computers and AI and some sort of digital bowl manifestation with like a symbolic bowl. So I visualized this bowl in my head, and then I visualized gold falling in the bowl, and then I forgot all about it, right? Because I had no expectations. I just did it, left it there. Well, 2 weeks later, I'm working at a farmer's market, and a gold coin falls on the table, and I look up, and there's nobody standing there. Whoever had dropped it had either like intentionally donated it and left and ran off, or had dropped it and just turned their back and mixed back in with the crowd. It was a pretty busy farmer's market.
Does this happen to you often?
Well, that was the standout manifestation that really showed me that
Right.
the reason why that had happened was because in that moment I realized I had to share that with my coworker because we both
Right.
equally deserved it. I
Right.
think that sort of intention played a part in it, but also the forgetting, not
Mm,
having an expectation to receive, but to set the intention that you're open to receiving. And that's what I did on the Susquehanna River. And less than 3 months later, I was working for Sam Tripoli, talking about spirituality on his new podcast, Zero, right? He had me on as the third guest. And then, he's like, who do you think I should have on next? And I emailed him like a 15-point list of all these different people, and he's like, wow, okay, maybe, do you want me to pay you to do this? And I'm like, hell yeah. So that's where people might be like, well, why did he explain that whole story? Well, for me, from my perspective, nothing happens by accident. There's no coincidences, nothing's
right.
happenstance. So that moment on the river connected me ultimately with Michael Wan, the Susquehanna alchemist. Because if I didn't work for Tripoli, I wouldn't have had a reason to email him to put him on Tinfoil Hat, and then eventually have him on my show. And that's the other thing. Sam inspired me to start My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, because when I told everybody in my family that I got a job working for Sam Tripoli, they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what? That's not a job. Like, what do you mean you're working on the internet for a comedian? How does that work? Like, so,
I
it's not
just sorry, I
just,
just wanted to say quickly, that's
go
what
ahead.
bothers me about this sort of, not even the older generation, because I don't want to put them all, there's some that adapt to the times, but that older mentality where if you're not leaving the house at a certain time in the morning and coming back in the afternoon, it's not considered a job. But I mean, it's all, again, I do believe that's shifting and changing quite quickly, but I also think there's a lot of people that haven't caught on to that yet. But sorry, please go on.
No, and yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a huge factor, but I think it's also, like I alluded to, the preparation that led me to having that opportunity with Sam. Not only had I listened to enough podcasts to be able to provide that service for Sam and be knowledgeable of this, kind of field, if you want to call it that, of
Right.
people and who's interesting, who has information and what information they have. There's a lot, and for whatever reason, that studying I did as a young kid about nature and memorizing every animal and every country and where they're from and all these little things that I was interested in as a kid, I realized now, like, oh, okay, that's why I have the memory to catalog these things. And so I think, within everybody's personal story are a set of skills that have dawned on you organically. And when you put attention on those skills and cultivate those skills, you start to grow more, those seeds spread and the
Right.
garden of who you are becomes more bountiful and beautiful. And that's just the process that I'm undergoing. Like Sam helped me out, gave me this opportunity in so many different ways, not only to make money doing something that doesn't serve the matrix and the man, but also
Right.
spreading truth and sharing knowledge and putting him in a position to speak to other really smart people who can share things that I can't.
Right. Right. Well, speaking of that, that kind of takes me to my next question, which one of the great things about you and I sort of having this conversation is that it's very rare where I don't necessarily have to prepare and it just kind of flows. And I want to thank you for that. But there was a former Russian general, now retired. My audience knows that I speak about this quite extensively. He said that in his book back in the 1980s, they were able, using no chemicals, no tech, no hardware or anything, they were able to tune the human brain using a certain to a they were tuning it, excuse me, to an energy contour. Basically, he described it as if you were fine tuning a radio to communicate frequentially to other galaxies that had alien civilizations. And he could not go into detail about how it was done, because I really do believe, and I think he knows, that if he told everyone in his book how to do it, everyone would be able to. But my question to you is, do you think there's been a suppression of those type of abilities? And if so, do you think there's been an energetic one? Do you think it's put in the food? Do you think it's in the water? I mean, a little bit of everything. What's your take on that?
I love that question. I love that where we're going to go with that. So, part of where I'm at and why I am who I am and why I told that story that maybe isn't, totally relatable, because, how many people get an opportunity to work for a comedian that also does a conspiracy podcast? There's not many. So I do feel really lucky, but at the same time, I've been studying this kind of thing for a while and I was prepared for the opportunity. So I want to encourage people to look within and create that situation for themselves so that can express itself however it will, whether that even means being involved in podcasting or not, because for me, it certainly has evolved into researching things in my own backyard, including my answer to your question, which is it is absolutely dietary. It is absolutely a symptom of the indoctrination process and the society building that the elite have practiced. That's a skill of theirs, is managing people and figuring out the best way to lead a society. That's the whole reason America was founded the way it was. They said, oh yeah, go there to have religious freedom. Well, what they don't tell you is, these religions, in a lot of cases, and I don't want to, discourage anybody who is very religious or spiritual from having faith, but I will say that there's a certain amount of programming, and they're like, well, let's see, who does a better job of programming, the Quakers, the Protestants, the Catholics. Let them all have land and see who does the best job, and then we'll let the pieces fall where they may. I think in a lot of ways, if you look at Francis Bacon and everything he did, that's exactly what was going on. They were making an experiment out of this land. I think a byproduct of that was, the desecration of the Native American indigenous culture. But to answer your question a little further, not only is it dietary, not only is it indoctrination, which they also, put that on the indigenous people, indoctrinated them into Christianity and all of that in Canada, all the way down to Chile and Argentina. But, here we go. The geonecromancy. They're literally finding ley lines, sacred sites, and then demagnetizing them. Why would they want to demagnetize sacred sites?
Oh, I didn't, dude. I didn't even think of that. I didn't even think they're demagnetizing the. Okay, so please go on. I'm really interested in this now.
So one thing that's emerged, over the past 2 years is the whole inquiry into Tartaria. Everything is a melted building, or something is buried in mud and then uncovered. And so there's a lot of angles and theories. I think the most interesting within that realm is everything dealing with the electric universe and how these buildings were possibly conductors of energy, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we have cathedral, cathode, there's no coincidence there. Why, and even down to the way those buildings are shaped, it looks like they're waiting for a lightning bolt to hit it, like you see in Scooby-Doo at the beginning of Scooby-Doo, but back to the point. So we have this culture of people who potentially were either the remnants from the Atlantean culture or a breakaway culture from Africa. Everybody wonders where the Aztecs came from out of nowhere with all their knowledge and abilities and information.
Right.
To me, I think it's vibration. It's electricity. People who understand, cultures that understand that we're an electric universe, are able to vibrate those stones to make them lighter than air and place them where they are. That's why you have huge megalithic stones placed in ways that are just inconceivable with our materialist paradigm technology.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, part of their knowledge, their esoteric knowledge, the royal bloodline that's passed this esoteric knowledge through the church, through Rome, through Egypt, Babylon, you can trace that through line of this occult secret society sort of group.
Not to mention the
different names.
Right. Sorry. Not to mention the censorship and curation of what they've given to the public.
Exactly. The esoteric versus the exoteric. They always give us, the crumbs while they get the meat, you know, we get the bread while they get the actual, like, you know, meat to chew on, the real
Right.
stuff that everybody who kind of wakes up, like cannabis offered for me, that wake up moment, you start to be like, well, you know, this stuff isn't, I need something more to chew on, you know, and you start looking deeper.
Right.
So, you know, back to the demagnetizing the earth, if you look all over in every city, you know, across the United States, in a town hall, in a town square, what do they have? They have stone monuments, they have obelisks, they have stone pillars, they have plaques on stones.
Right.
And they've even gone and taken some of these mounds that the indigenous cultures were building and flattened them, leveled them, destroyed them, or even just built on top of them, or
Yeah.
renamed or repurposed, built a statue on top of it. And
Right.
all of this is a demagnetizing. You know, metal is not, you know, it's everything comes from the earth. You know, there's no such thing as like unorganic material ultimately, you know, even though we
Right.
refine things to their smaller parts and create plastic, which doesn't
Well,
seem natural.
as they say, our best tricks come from nature.
Yeah.
Right.
But you know, when we look at metal, you know, especially when it comes to being a bioluminescent organic being that we are, metal zaps our natural aura. It has a negative effect on our human aura. And I
Mm.
think our human aura, our energy bodies, are restored by the magnetic electric energy that is exchanged as we stand between the earth and the sky. You
Right.
know, and when ancient people were building these stone structures, they were trying to create a larger version of that, so that you would have a sort of toroidal field built around these structures, so that anyone who came in contact, I mean, I don't know, if I've never been to Teotihuacan or any pyramid, but I'm sure anyone who has, you know, I've heard people say this, that there's just a sense of awe, you know, and some people might just say that's because it's such a beautiful building. But I think you and I, if we went there, we might say, like, from a more logical perspective, like, I am actually feeling something, like,
Right.
all
Yeah.
bias aside, all pre-assumptions aside, there is a buzz here, you know. Even like the most logical person would have to like lie to themselves, because they wouldn't, you know, see that in their paradigm. So they might just say like, oh well, I'm in awe because this building's magnificent, or there's a lot of human energy here, you know, however they'll write it
Well,
off. But
that's
at the end of the
sorry
day,
if
go
I could
ahead.
say very quickly, that's like
Yeah.
when I have some family, they've been to, you know, Shangri-La, they've been to, personally myself, I haven't, but they've been to these parts where there's these ancient structures and you name it. And very quickly, my uncle was telling me a story about how, you know, he went with his high school to, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, Shangri-La, if I'm not mistaken. However, I could be wrong. But anyways, it was one of these very ancient, you know, trying to figure out nowadays how they did it type of thing. And then all of a sudden, my uncle says to the teacher, or the guide, excuse me, what's that over there? And then the guide says, oh, that's an observatory. And my uncle says, wait, when was it built? And the guide goes, well, at the time that, you know, everything else was. And my uncle thinks to himself in his head, why do they need an observatory? How did they even know? Right? Let alone map out the constellations of stars, of things that only we can see now with our digital telescopes. But sorry, please go on.
Right. And that, you know, highlights what we initially danced around, which was the stone alignments.
Right.
Why are the indigenous people of my area, the area I was born, uh, you know, lining structures up to this Hammonasset line? Well, these are people that, according to what, you know, people say, because I never met an indigenous person from this time, but according to what's written and what's passed down, they were migratory people. You know, they would go
Mm.
one place when it was cold, they'd come another place when it was warm. So it's very important to them to have a bearing on what part of the year it was, exact timing, so they can say like, okay, when we're all the way up here, you know, in the summer in the north part, we need to know on this day to get moving, because it's going to take this long to get down to Long Island, you know, where it's going
Right.
to be warm enough to survive the winter. That might be a month or a 2-month trek, you know, in
Right.
those days. So those kind of timing from that logical perspective, we could say, okay, well, that makes sense. These people were moving great distances. They needed to have a good bearing on what time of the year it was, and even, where they were. Because they
Right.
could follow this line if they knew where each stone alignment was, and maybe even like live their whole year based on what part of the line they're on,
Right. Yeah.
And when we're thinking about this as like a ley line, it's like, oh, wow, okay, interesting. So now they're like following energy back and forth. Are they aware of that? I would say from the less, logical perspective, yeah, probably, because we are intuitive beings and there's something that's conscious about our environment that interacts with us, like ayahuasca. I've never done it. It's a huge topic. It's a huge thing for people, especially people who listen to these types of shows. And
Psilocybin, ayahuasca, the whole thing. Yeah.
right, but particularly ayahuasca, I bring that up because the story is, the Jivaro people, or whichever indigenous tribe discovered the right concoction, the right mixture. They didn't figure it out by trial and error. They were told by spirits. They would have killed a lot of their own friends and relatives if they did trial and error. There's a lot of poisonous plants in the Amazon jungle, and creatures
Right.
too.
Right.
So you don't have time to just like go exploring and testing different plants
And to pass around the ayahuasca. Yeah.
yeah, but they found out of all the plants, that this Banisteriopsis vine had the MAOI inhibitor in it that took the DMT out of all these other plants, because most plants have DMT in there. You don't have to go very far to find DMT, but that MAOI inhibitor in that vine is very rare. So they talked about, well, we didn't figure it out. Our spirit guides told us, our ancestors told us, whichever label you want to put on it, there was a multi-dimensional, interdimensional, otherworldly explanation for how they got that very important information. That is,
right.
You take that drug and what happens? You kind of go into another dimension, so I think that indicates that our world is conscious.
Now, would you say that the purpose for the demagnetization is a couple of questions within this big one, sort of, is being done by world governments currently because they want to suppress the average person from, reaching out to their spirit guides, ancestors, or maybe even like that Russian general said, sending out messages frequentially into space? Do you think that's that's what's happening now? When you say demagnetizing, who's doing it? Who do you think is doing it?
Yeah.
And for what reason?
Well, and this is all going off, like I said, very largely inspired by Ross Ben,
right,
Michael Wan, and also, my own collection of things I've learned over my 26 years. And I would say that it seems to me at this point in time that there's a group that has knowledge of all these things the way it is.
Right.
And they realize, like, okay, we need to be the only ones who know this knowledge if we're going to play that society manager game that I described when we first started talking.
Right.
So they have to, have that balance of exoteric, esoteric. And I just had a really close friend of mine who left the church, and he was like, dude, I realized that they were just trying to incentivize people psychologically to remain poor. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? He's like, dude, he's like, they just kept saying, like, it's easier to get, a rich man through the eye of a needle. I'm not going to repeat that phrase. People have heard that saying, but he made a really great point that, like, it does seem like some of these places are just trying to give people a comfortable narrative through which to live their mediocre life in effort to keep them in a certain status in the stratified class system that we're born into, that's created by this 1%,
the hierarchy.
Right. And they use this, fake religion that they've created with some real stuff hidden in between, just to give us enough to be hungry for it. And not enough to ever look further than that, because they have the secrets, So I think they've manifested themselves through the Roman Empire, then the British, French, and Spanish empires, and then eventually the American Empire, and obviously still the British Empire French Empire, I mean, that's a whole different history that I'm not extremely familiar with. And I think, things like the Chinese Communist government, which was largely influenced by America, in a lot of co-opted, CIA kind of ways. Like George Bush Sr. was the ambassador to China, in the 70s, around, after that whole period. And I think that's like, it's not, you know, it's not a coincidence. They were setting that up through Skull and Bones. They had their relationship with China going back to the 1800s, with the opium wars and the
Right.
drug trade. So, and that's just one whole tangent we don't have to go down because it doesn't totally answer the question you asked. But I think, these players have many ways to make money now: guns, oil, drugs, sex trafficking. But
Right.
their main interests are, and when I say satanic, I'm really leaning these days towards more like a Saturnist death cult, in terms of like what Troy McLaughlin was talking about recently on the Higher Side Chats. I definitely encourage people to check his interview out. And I think that it seems like when we look at our history, there was a point when there was a golden age, and a group emerged from that time that wanted to remain in that golden age for good reason, but ultimately that evolved into them just lusting for power and the divine right to rule. And they remember this time when people did sacrifice human beings, and killed them and murdered them. And I think that's a part of their sort of secret religion. And that's why, all of the things we're uncovering about these cults today is so like, whoa, like really, like holy shit, sorry to curse
Right.
so much on your show, but
No, it's an open ball game, man. But just
cool.
curious though, when you say secret group or secret groups, factions around the world, you name it, at least relative to current modern times, in your opinion, based off of your knowledge, your personal experiences with geomancy and things like that, and what you've read, who do you think consists of these groups? And when I say that, I mean in like relative to how we would define positions of today: academics, politicians, military generals. You think a little bit of everything. They're all in these groups in order to give one another a perspective. You got a couple generals in there, you got a couple high level scientists, you got a couple things like that. Who do you think, in your opinion, are in these groups, or this one group?
So I think to answer that question, we need to go back a little bit. And like, when we talk about Rome became the Roman Catholic Church,
Right. Yep.
And we talk about the Jesuits, we talk about the Freemasons, we talk about the Rosicrucians. These are all groups that are serving an agenda. Now, those groups may exist for that agenda for a short period of time and then remain an entity, but no longer serve that agenda in the way it once did.
Right.
Because they've adapted behind the scenes to kind of keep that puppet in the whole marionette show, but it's not the main player anymore.
They kind of go rogue with their intentions.
Well, and yeah, that definitely is the case, I think, with a lot of these places, because something that Sam talks about a lot on his show, and a lot of people have been saying, at least in this past year, is that it's like a spiritual war. It really, I feel, that might be kind of hyperbole and extremist to someone with a more scientific view. Not saying that that's you, Dave, but I think that like it's definitely, to me, from my more spiritual angle. And keep in mind, folks, I was raised Roman Catholic, became kind of atheist, and then cannabis brought me back into like looking into spirituality.
Right.
And so from that perspective, I say that it's a mode of thinking that goes along with the methodology, and it's pushed by groups of families who believe that they have a bloodline tie to divine, divine right to rule, like going all the way back, if you want to go back to Egypt, and I'm not a scholar on ancient times, but I think once you start to hear what folks are saying who are interested in those realms and experts in those realms, they talk about cataclysm, and they talk about this fall. And it seems to me like there might be a parasitic interdimensional being of some sort that is helping that group that calls themselves, who say they have the divine right. I think they're classifying their god as divine because it's serving them in that, incestuous way, that parasitic way where the parasite is using them to ultimately feed on the rest of us. It's like, giving up your arm, to save your body in a way, but you don't cut your hand off and the parasite just continues to suck your blood until you die. It's like,
Right.
that's kind of like they're like, well, we'll keep you alive, hand, if you just let us kill the whole body, and the hand's
Smart.
like, okay, I'll do it, and I think that's when you really go into the multidimensional spiritual stuff, it does seem like these groups have relationships with beings that are not human. And when you asked about why are they do you think that they're keeping us from our ability to communicate with other worldly beings? I think absolutely yes. Like when you look at ancient indigenous cultures, they all talk about having relationships with star beings. Even in Africa, the Dogon people talk about the Sirius B, alignment that wasn't visible to the naked eye, but they knew that there was a, binary star in that, region of the sky. And that's the same group of people that, according to Ross Ben and his research, migrated from Africa to Mexico or into the Caribbean. And then they come along, these royals, these, empires, as I call them. The empire comes along and it says, well, we brought all these people from Africa. They're not from here. This is
Right.
our land. Nobody here was Christian and we're Christians. So our goal is to save the world in God's name. So it's, our right, our divine right to take this land from the indigenous people. But then you look in, these deep, ways, like this spirit in the stone book, they talk about how there are archaeological finds of what look like Hebrew letters in America dating back to when only indigenous people were here. So that to me is even more evidence that's like, okay, maybe people from Africa came here, maybe people from the Middle East came here, the lost tribes of Israel, this kind of thing. And that to me is where I've been learning and researching. And that's why I encourage people like to go and look for themselves in their own backyard. Because I didn't go to, I took one anthropology class because I thought this stuff was interesting, and then I dropped out. But I'm still in a way doing that and engaging in that type of research without having, $50,000 or however much more spent at one of these institutions that were created to indoctrinate people to be a part of the empire. So connecting it maybe back to the more interesting thing that we were just talking about. It's like the people that migrated across the Atlantic Ocean, they did that, and that knowledge was passed along to folks like Francis Bacon in the 15th, 16th century, 17th century times, before America had really gotten, to be its own thing. They were planning, shaping it, they were selling patents on land and charters and titles, saying like, oh yeah, like everything east of this river is yours if you can make it there and not get killed by the braves that are there, and like,
do you think, as you go on and you say these things, which by the way I really appreciate your responses, do you think the influence is that, in your personal opinion? I mean, I know that people like you and me, our opinions, we're always open to changing our perceptions and things like that. But at this current time, do you think there is an influence, whether it derives from that secret group or multiple groups, if you want to call it, or bloodlines, families, whatever you want to say? Do you think it's more extraterrestrial or interdimensional, a little bit of both? I mean, and then I wanted to sort of ask your take on the whole, alleged reptilian sort of thing? I know that some people laugh, some people take it very seriously. So would you lean more interdimensional, more extraterrestrial, or would you say there's both at play, sort of?
Yeah, not to offend any of my flat earth friends, I don't disbelieve in space. I don't quite believe we're able to access it with like what they tell us we have.
Right.
So maybe that plays into this answer I'm about to give, which is I think it's multidimensional. And I think our understanding of where we are in the universe is just flawed because the same people in this empire I talked about have sort of given us a certain paradigm through which to see the world. And, I think the people in indigenous cultures who say, we have relationships with star beings, they use different terms, different cultures use different words for it. Some even say they come from underneath the ocean. So to me that just indicates that these beings come from somewhere else. There's even stories
Right.
of beings taking indigenous people into underground caves and helping them avoid a cataclysm by sheltering them underground.
Yeah.
And like Ari Asalin, who's been on my show twice, he talks about how these Grand Canyon, certain canyons look like, they've been carved out with lightning bolts, more evidence of the electric universe and maybe even ancient, weapons that we
Right.
hear in like the Rig Veda and books like that come from India. But, to answer your question a little more fully, I think that it's definitely a matter of interaction with other beings. I think that the multidimensional nature seems to be related to ritual because indigenous
Mm.
cultures have a very close relationship with the other world through ritual.
Right.
Western culture, like we talked about, they have the exoteric versus the esoteric. They give us all this stuff about the story of Jesus and how great he was, but they create a middleman between us and creator, where we're like, well, we can only experience creator through this person. He's the best. And like
Right.
he did it all for us and then he died. So feel sorry for him, and it just creates
Right.
this really like interesting, way of living your life that I've gotten really sick of being in New England. It just seems like it doesn't serve people very well. They tend to, drink too much or live a kind of meager, meaningless, from their own opinion, not me. This is people telling me this stuff, because I don't want to pass that kind of judgment on anybody, but seemingly meaningless life. And I think that's indicative of the esoteric being removed from Western culture in order to insulate it within the 1% hierarchy structure, however they take their shape, whether that's through these elite families. And then to go into your lizard question, absolutely, brother, because back when I was in community college taking that anthropology class, I would take breaks between classes in the park, New Haven Green, right in the center of town.
Right.
And I was sitting there one day smoking a spliff, and I probably told this story a bunch of times on podcasts, but I'll make it
Please.
kind of short and sweet and all the best parts. So I'm sitting there, I have a Sitting Bull t-shirt on, and a guy walks up to me, short, squat, dark, black hair, very clearly an indigenous person,
Right.
and not the type that's from around here, not to pass judgment again, but he didn't look like he was from around here. And he strikes up a conversation with me, the weed and the shirt, we had mutual interests that were
Right.
very obvious. And he introduced himself as somebody from Arizona, a Pueblo Indian. And we started talking about Sitting Bull, who was on my shirt. We started talking about weed, and next thing I know, every other day I'm seeing him at the park and we become friends. And I asked him, like, what are you doing around here? And he's like, well, right now I'm homeless. I'm like, why are you homeless? What's going on? And he's like, well, I'm not gonna lie to you, I was in prison and I really I feel like I wronged my community. So when I got out of prison, I came to New Haven, Connecticut, miles away from where I've lived my whole life, because when I was in prison, I heard this story about Geronimo and how Geronimo's skull and bones were taken from Oklahoma and brought to High Street, New Haven, Yale University, inside of the Skull and Bones tomb. And that hurt him so much because he is, and that's one of his ancestors, whether it's through tribe or through actual, grandfather to grandfather, he's related to Geronimo. And he came to New Haven with nothing on his back but, just a shirt and pants, and just made it happen, and by praying to Geronimo, whether it was like his spirit or even just the bones that were removed in that desecrational way, in that same demagnetizing way, he would stand in front of the tomb every day at noon and scream Geronimo as loud as he could. And man, I stood next to him, and it was the most powerful thing I've ever heard somebody, yell in a beautiful way. And it touched me so deeply, all the things he taught me, and all the things that we learned just through our couple months of maybe a year or two of friendship, just smoking here and there together. It taught me that, like, A, this stuff is real deal, and B, this guy isn't lying to me. So this kind of gives you the foundation for what I'm about to tell you. So
Sure.
smoking weed, I was very interested in psychedelics. I was very interested in all the Native American information on alternative stuff. So he broke it down to me. He's like, well, when I was about your age, my grandfather and my father, they took me out into the same spot that they went when they were my age, in the desert, in the mesa, and they gave me peyote. And I sat there by myself for 2 days, before they came back to get me.
Whoa.
And, before they even went out there, they did a sweat lodge. And then after, when they came to get him, they did another sweat lodge. And he didn't eat, you don't eat, you just drink like whatever water that you brought with you, or
Right.
if you're lucky enough to find water in the desert, you get some more.
Right.
If you know the secret. But either way, whether it was the first, second, third, fourth day, at some point he leaves his body and goes into the ground, and he meets a being that he described as a female lizard. Okay.
Huh.
And she taught him things that his father and his grandfather and his great grandfather and all these men in his tribe who take this rite of passage, they all have this same experience with this woman, goddess, lizard person. Like, you could use any of those words interchangeably, but at the end of the day, they revere this spirit, this thing, as a spiritual teacher, and it takes a form of a lizard. Maybe that's because they're in the desert and there's a lot of lizard reptile energy in that animal totem kind of way.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
with our conspiratorial lens and knowing things about like Skinwalker Ranch and Roswell and all of these underground bases and all these other things, and even the story I relayed about beings from the underground saving people from the Hopi or Zuni tribe, by taking them underground, it's like, well, to this day, people can have that potentially experience. I think it's very much connected to his blood and who he is. I don't think if I took the peyote, I would have that same experience with that lizard being.
I see
think
what you're saying.
The
Yeah.
place also has a factor. Maybe there actually is something underground there where they take people to go and have that ritual on the mesa and leave them out there for a couple of days, and on peyote, basically. So learning that from him, and learning who he was over a period of time, growing to trust him, and like also learning like the way of the shaman from the book by Michael Harner by the same title, and also the Yaqui Way by Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda's books. All of these factors kind of really shaped who I became, to answer where we were talking about before.
Right.
But also showed me like, holy crap, there's actual conspiracies out there that aren't just like fiction. Like I was interested in this stuff, but I didn't know what to believe because I've never seen a Bigfoot. I've never seen a lizard person, like
Right.
I'd love to, but at that point in my life, I had only read about that kind of stuff and wasn't sure what to think. And then here comes this guy who walks into my life, teaches me about the power of sage, teaches me about cannabis, tobacco, about this lizard person that he met on peyote. So yeah, man, to sum it up, I think, yes, there are lizard beings out there. And I think that when I try to figure out what's going on, I tend to go to the indigenous cultures and their understanding of the world because they're the ones who have least been affected by the empire, so to speak. At least the
Right.
ones that have done a good job of, maintaining their oral traditions, and the ones that maybe have been, less messed with. So we'll have to wait and see if the Sentinel Island people ever learn to write and see what they've been thinking about for 2000 years. But
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
that's like, I think that's where my fascination comes from. And that's why, like, living in Connecticut, honoring the Pequot people who actually lived here for much longer than Europeans did, and like understanding their history and where their monuments were, that's become really important to me because I think in a like a synchromistic way, going back to what Michael Wan and Ross Ben do, you can really like dive into the mystery that is your life, and it's going to take its own course depending on who you are. For me, that's what this entails. And I think anybody who's listening to a show like this, they could probably go and do something very similar. If you're from New York State, there's thousands of places you can go to get in touch with these celestial alignments. New
Right.
England is like the one last untouched area. Most of the Mississippi culture is pretty well documented. The Ohio culture is pretty well documented, but
Right.
again, the people who are documenting them, they have a certain bias and a perspective and an agenda that I think is worth looking at through a conspiratorial lens, like the Smithsonian Institute and all the things that they've done covering things up, giants and all that.
Well, that actually kind of takes me to my final two questions, which I think will take a bit, but will be well worth it. The first one is, I know these are quite vague questions in a certain way, so please answer them as you see fit. Your perspective of the electric universe, and if you think that generally people are missing something from that understanding of that theory. And also, I know this is going to be a big one, but we sort of touched on it at first, and I just want to expand on it before wrapping up. Your perception of time. So in either order, doesn't matter. Please, the floor is yours. Take as long as you like.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, time is I like to think, when you think in the past, that's anxiety, regret, all those emotions, are in the past. The future has those same attachments, but being present is what's important. And all we have is the present, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's kind of like the understanding of time. But I also wanted to point out something David Icke said that I really enjoy. It's think of the matrix as a whirlpool and the infinite oneness as the river. The matrix is still the river, the infinite one, but like a whirlpool, it is operating in its own little world to its own agenda. What has happened, I was told in my altered states, is that the matrix was forgotten. It is the infinite. The whirlpool has forgotten it is the river. So I think time is, like the river, and we're like that whirlpool. If you've ever kayaked or canoe, you know what I'm talking about. That whirlpool, you create it with the oar when you're pushing on the water, and it spins. It has its own direction and path, and then it's kind of gone, and it only existed in that really kind of sublime way. So yeah, man, that's kind of time to me. It's just like a river. We're just standing in a river that's constantly moving. So
Do
it's
you see
never
all
the same.
points? Sorry, do you see all points of time as equal, as some of these extraterrestrials have allegedly taught some of our leaders? I mean, not to say that they took that knowledge with good intention, but again, just conveying that knowledge to them in the sense of time being equal. And it seems like through quantum physics, we're finding that to be the case more and more on a public level. But do you subscribe to that or not particularly?
I think it's interesting. I hadn't heard that from those sources, but I think in a sort of intuitive way that makes sense to me. I think like art is indicative of time. Like time is kind of like essential in making art, and art is just an expression of creation, is expression of life. What is art? It's just creation. It's just, everything is kind of art. So I wish I had this book ready, but hold
No,
on.
no problem.
This will be quick because this is something that I've really. So the law of time states that time is the universal frequency of synchronization. It is the nature of time to synchronize and to maintain all things in a condition of synchronization. Synchronicity then is the experience of real time. When we say that time is a frequency, we can be more precise and say that time is a universal constant expressible by the mathematical ratio 1320. Okay, so the law of time is formulated very simply and in some people's way of thinking rather unscientifically as art T equals parentheses E equals art. Energy factored by time equals art. So, I think
Huh.
energy was the word I was looking for just then. But that comes from Jose Arguelles in his book Time and the Technosphere. And the reason why that 1320 is important is because we have 13 28-day cycles. Now, yeah, that's not completely exact, but
Sorry, brother. What book was that from? I'm just writing that energy plus time equals art. That's a great. What this is called, Time
Time and the
and the
Technosphere.
Technosphere.
Yeah, this is a great book by Jose Arguelles. And, I've been looking through this a lot, talking about it on my Patreon show and how people can get more in tune with the 13 moon cycle, because that's part of the empire's deception, is creating this calendar that throws us out of harmony and demagnetizes us with the natural calendar, the harmony that is the universe that we're in. It kind of is like a whirlpool, a cycle. It's constantly spinning upwards into uh, wherever it's going. I mean, that's for us to determine. I think that's kind of like the law of attraction stuff. But I feel like I missed the boat on answering the second question, but maybe I answered the first question
Maybe,
or
you know
vice
what?
versa.
Sort of, I think the two are very much intertwined, but I mean, it's interesting you say that about sort of like a whirlpool or sort of that twirling motion, because recently I've been covering in my public episodes, quick connection for the audience, about the work by Dan Winters and how he speaks about, anti-gravity technology and things like that. Again, many different ways to harness the way in which they propel their craft off the ground. But again, magnetization versus demagnetization, working like an elastic band, again similar to even what you have up right now in your background, brother, the as above so below, right? The yin and the yang, so to speak, right? That sort of balance. And it seems like, again, on more technological side, but we could also say, I guess, electric universe theory side as well, that when the craft propel, there's another end of it as well where it's sort of like that magnetized movement. So it's interesting that you bring that up. But it was the questions were electric universe theory and your perception of, or your thoughts on time.
Okay, so then on the electric universe theory, I've had a couple conversations on my podcast. My family thinks I'm crazy about that, and it's definitely fascinated me ever since I've learned more and more about it. Especially knowing what I know about Tesla and his technology, and again, not the expert, but to me, the
In your
megalithic
opinion,
structures,
right?
to me, the megalithic structures are indicative of something like that, because when we look at cymatics and we look at how electricity and vibration and pattern and like all of these things fit together in a syncretic way. I just had Santos Bonacci on my podcast talking about syncretism. That episode will be out actually the same day as this one, so people should check that out. But
Sweet.
it's definitely something that I think makes the most sense. And then if we want to really connect the mythologies and the indigenous culture's perception of paradigm and worldview, it fits into everything they say. I mean, Thunderbird and, all of these different stories from many different cultures. I'm not just talking about North America here. It's all over the world. You have, stories of like a lightning being that, creates things. And, not that we need to rest our hat on mythology and story, but for me, I think when you start trying to understand the story of your life and how it fits into the larger story that is the human story, you start to notice signs, symbols, and synchronicities, the lowercase s's that fit into the uppercase S that is the story, and I think when you start to notice those S's, you start to connect dots, and you might feel like a crazy person, like connecting all these random dots. But if you trust your intuition, at the very least, you're going to change your life for the better. If you have positive intention too, I think that's the other thing. Is like, that's true for me. So if that makes this an electric universe, like, I think that's what that means to me. Like, we're electricity. You see how water reacts to electricity. Our bodies are 78% water. What happens if you get too much voltage? You get fried. So I mean, there's even like people that their whole foot has turned to stone. A guy's foot turned to stone because he had so much voltage running through him. He worked for a power company. A lot of unfortunate accidents from those guys that work on with electricity, and it seems to be superhuman sometimes. What they're not superhuman, supernatural, what happens to them, but it's very natural within an electric universe paradigm. It's only in this materialist universe paradigm where things like this petrification or piezoelectric type situation seem kind of weird. But when we start to re-examine what we know through the electric universe lens, seems to me like things start to line up more and make more sense. So no, not the expert in my opinion, though. Yes, definitely. And that's something that I do plan on talking about and learning more about on my show. And Santos actually mentioned that. So for like in passing, but it's worth listening to, folks. If that's a good endorsement of my show. But please check it out, episode 77, Santos Bonacci. We also talked about Led Zeppelin. I don't know if that, but when I saw Dave Zed, I kind of like in a maybe
Led Zeppelin will resonate with some of my audience for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, in like a maybe what's the word? In like of course, I'm a dyslexic. I'm forgetting the word dyslexic. That's dyslexic. In a dyslexic way, I saw your name Zed and thought of Led Zeppelin. So I just thought I would bring that up and see if that resonated.
Absolutely. I just honestly, man, I was gonna wrap it up. I just had one more question, and I'll be totally straight with you. I think I'm gonna have you on again a bunch of times because we can just keep going and going and going.
Yeah, let's do it.
We should even do a whole playlist or a series if you ask me. But paranormal versus not versus rather, but would you put the classification of paranormal and interdimensional or multidimensional in the same category? Would you say that, people having paranormal experiences, which again, I mean, the accounts of them for God knows how long have been quite not really anything that far out there for a lot of people around the world, really. Would you put, paranormal beings as beings that haven't fully, I don't want to use the word the term crossed over, right? Because there's proposals that there's certain aliens that are working with our governments to sort of keep us in a soul trap or a soul cycle after our physical body dies. But what's your take on the paranormal relative to, the beings that you told about, the Indian tribe, the native tribe, seeing the lizard woman? What do you like in your personal perspective, your experience, your opinion? What do you classify paranormal as? Like,
I think that there's a condition that we have as human beings to forget where we came from, and we sort of think of existence and living as like this thing where you have a physical body. And when we encounter beings that seem to act in ways that would indicate that they don't have a physical body, we have to like classify them as something else. But I think, you know, just like animals have different abilities, conscious beings such as humans are in a different class and have their own specialty and ability. And because of this earth that we're on, we forget our soul's, you know, path, our true celestial nature, our real connection. And when we dream, we sort of, you know, and I'm not I'm really unsure about this, but I think it's a really fascinating thing to explore, is like, what is a dream? Where are you going? Is that your soul leaving your body? You know, I just talked to a guy who astral projected and does it frequently, and you know, there's a lot of really amazing things that he's learned and come back with from those journeys. And I think that's something that spiritual people have done for thousands of years, you know.
Would you, would you put, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but would you put the paranormal experiences or beings at a lower density, let's call it, than these other interdimensional ones that, you know, if you took a ayahuasca, psilocybin, magic mushroom, things like that, that you would see at a more ascended level, whereas paranormal seems to be, I don't want to say descended, but more grounded or dense, if you want to call it, like, because of their ability to move objects in some cases, you know, paranormal stories that people tell all the time.
I think it's again, it's a matter of case, in the sense of like, if you walked into a rattlesnake den, right, you're looking for trouble, you know?
Yeah.
I think these beings, even though they treat us malevolently, it's because of our misunderstanding of our reality and our confusion on that level,
right,
that makes us just write them off all as evil. I think we're just not understanding an interaction. I think human beings are the same as them in a way. They just have a different ability to interact with the different dimensions than we do. We kind of interact with it in this way where for half the day we're in third dimensional consciousness, and for the other half of the day some of us are in fourth dimensional consciousness. Some of us have been toxified to the point where maybe they don't remember their dreams. I'm someone who can say like, maybe that's the case for me most of the year, but and not like I'm doing drugs or anything, but I mean like your energy, your environment is toxic, you know. But either way, I think, you know, ghosts, Bigfoot, all of them, every single being, they exist in front of our eyes. They're moving in front of us, but because we're so wired into this third dimensional vibration, we don't tend to see them until we're out maybe in the middle of nowhere, where there's less energy to interfere with our aura, our energy body. So I think it's just a matter of like, we've forgotten to a large degree who we are, what we're doing here, why we're here, and who are our neighbors in this reality. And that provokes a lot of fear, which makes us think like, well, they're all evil, they're all demons. And like that plays into like the whole Christian perspective too, and the empire building. It's like, well, they don't want us to have a good relationship with the elementals because then we might, you know, be magnetized and be more in tune with our environment and get away from their city building, you know. So they told us about all the demons, and I don't think that means that there's no such thing as demons. I think that, you know, those elementals could be really mad and do some really bad things, you know, all these spirits, you know, the way they manifest, you know. And even on the side of like the parasitic being, like wherever they came from, and even like the Pleiades, you know, like we have the Pleiadian teachers, you know, my girlfriend listens to Pleiadians often and I listen to it with her. And then you hear stories of like, well, you know, in the old days, Pleiadians were like killing the Andromedans. And so I think like, even when you look in the stars and the star beings that are allegedly out out there, there's good and there's bad.
Right.
There's
Right.
like, there's Sasquatch, but then there's Dog Man, there's
Right.
there's like a ghost that knocks over your, fine china, and then there's like a ghost that like pushes like a brick onto your head, like I think
Yeah.
there's degrees to it, and it's more based on like our confusion in a lot of ways and how we're disrupting these natural forces that were already there before us, because we have this really confused paradigm of what we're in, and we're just kind of stumbling around blindly, not realizing that we're in a room with the light shut off, thinking that we have it all figured out. We know where the kitchen is and we know where the bathroom is, and we can make our way to all these rooms. But if we had only turned the light on, then we would see that the room's not empty and there's all kinds of things we've been bumping into, and just explaining them as like, oh, that hurts, and that's it, not going ever further past that there's something hurting you. I think it's like in a spiritual way, in a metaphysical, multidimensional way, that's what's happening.
So you think there are actually there's multiple, arguably, like this universe is teeming with life, but just in ways that we can't see.
Right. Yeah. And like, we only see like probably 70% or something of the light spectrum, so
Right.
there is literally, scientifically, we want to be super logical and less intuitive. That's scientifically proven that we're only seeing a certain amount of light, UV, ultraviolet, all those spectrums, red light, there's all sorts of, Kirlian photography. You were talking about that on, I think, one of your more recent episodes.
Yeah, a couple days ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was like super interesting, because I've had a book about Kirlian photography that I've been like holding on to for a long time that I've never read too thoroughly, but it's interesting because there's all these pictures of like a soul leaving a guy's body who's dying on a hospital bed, and I think that's a pretty famous image. People can look that up, but it's legit. Like, that guy took that picture. There's no artist that like came in and drew that.
Right.
And when you see that picture, it's pretty compelling. And yeah, that's, one of the many reasons why I believe in like reincarnation and all the other things that having a soul might, you can extrapolate from that. Some people see it differently. They believe in like the heaven paradigm, but I think heaven and hell are metaphors for a life, that you can either make for yourself or someone makes it for you, like we were talking about before, where they get you used to living in hell. Like, life's hell, get used to it. There's nothing you can do to change it. You're just a powerful, and that's what the flat earth people say a lot of times too, is like, we're just, and I agree with that whole line of thinking, like, we're not meaningless, but the whole scientism movement is trying to get us to think we're just like meaningless, nothing on a floating rock in space. And whether you think that's because globe versus flat, or spiritual war, or however you want to interpret it, I think there's something about meaning that's important, and they're trying to keep us away from understanding it.
And to add to that too quickly, I also think as well that it's backfiring in the long term on these people that are doing that, because like you said, you're going to have people saying, like they're doing now, we could argue COVID's escalated that, but even before, people saying, why am I here? Why am I waking up every morning to go do, work this 9 to 5 to pay these bills, arguably, that are fake. It's value that we give, that it's money that we give value to, right? It's something we give value to. And if enough people, as my girlfriend gave a perfect example this morning, said, if enough people got up in the morning and went to the bank and pulled out all their assets and their money and liquidated everything in cash, the banks would then have to cave to the people, right? And so I think it's going to backfire, like you said, because now you're going to have people such as you and me and our audiences and our communities that are extrapolating into all these different things. And now they're thinking, oh Christ, like, how the hell can we suppress this? Right. So, and it seems like they're trying to play whack-a-mole with the internet censorship and all that. But I'm really sorry. I know I keep saying the last two, but I promise the last two. Your thoughts on adrenochrome and COVID. This will be for the Patreon members, because there's no way YouTube will let this stay up. But do you truly believe that there is a form of, within the child sex trafficking apparatus or operation, aside from obviously the depraved stuff that Epstein would do and all that for those terrible people, but do you think there is a literal soul sucking? For example, Linda Moulton Howe, if I'm not mistaken, shortly before, Carla Turner, my apologies, was doing one of her final seminars, talking about how a military eyewitness account witnessed a bunch of children's souls being extracted into these what seem to be glass boxes, and it was done through the eye, as you know the rumors are about adrenochrome and all that. Do you subscribe to any of that, or you don't think so?
Well, that particular piece of information that you just shared is new to me. But I definitely have heard, all the things about adrenochrome, whether you're talking about Hunter S. Thompson, recently I heard something about Mark Twain, which is
Yeah,
interesting for me because he's from Connecticut, a place that I'm looking into in that investigatory synchromistic way that I've learned from Mike and Ross. So, and then the whole Google Chrome thing
yeah,
and like, everything that goes into researching the occult connections in Hollywood and secret societies. Yeah, man, there's, you know, I'll bring it back to New Haven, Connecticut, the place that taught me so much about this whole realm of thinking in a way that they didn't intend. The house in the center of town has
mm,
a edifice
right,
of a Roman looking emperor sitting at a throne, two Roman sort of lieutenant general guys leaning against the throne, and then like on their legs are like child boys, and then like next to the throne are child boys, and this is
right,
all like carved, like naked
yeah,
boys next to like Roman seeming people. So you can see even in like a place like New Haven where the iconography of the like actual court building is
right,
indicating this kind of weird relationship between adults and children. And I think what that really shows is that a place like a courthouse, a place like Skull and Bones, maybe
mm,
even Yale University, these institutions, they have a secret culture, let's call it, that has remained secret through their ability to have power over the rest of us and play with our cultures and manipulate our cultures and fight, turn cultures against one another for
right,
their gain. So whether or not that's one of their practices, I mean, people have heard my interview with Sam on Tinfoil Hat about Aleister Crowley. One of the things I learned about Aleister Crowley was he definitely wrote about that subject and like in a graphic way.
right,
So I was personally disturbed by that, and just took that as a sign to stop researching him, because I learned as much as I needed to, and also I think it's a part of it, whether it's
right,
through sexual abuse, through mental abuse, through spiritual abuse. There are ways that the elite have figured out, to manipulate people in really dark and disturbing ways. So, and
yeah,
that's part of the whole guns, oil, drugs, and sex trafficking thing that I laid out. One of the things that Troy McLaughlin said on his Higher Side Chats interview was the ancient system of money was called Sodom, right? But we think of Sodom as like meaning homosexual, but in ancient times, Sodom was another word for poppy and opium. So,
huh,
and he talked about how this place, Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's a Christian, so take that for what it is. I
right,
kind of have a less factional look at things, but he said that Sodom and Gomorrah had more to do with opium and an economy based on drugs. And if you look at what you see today with the vaccine, to answer that question too,
thank you,
that they're the big pharmaceutical companies were literally created by those same groups of people that evolves from the Roman Empire, the royal bloodlines. They went to
right,
places like Prussia, which became Germany, which had its whole thing in World War II when the whole world was restructured. It seems, and especially when we look at the celebrity stuff, like look at,
yeah,
what they do. They kill someone in their own family in order to get ahead. Well, what if the Germans took that sacrifice? They created a demon in their own backyard in order to change the world for their agenda in that subversive way, using that guy as a scapegoat. I'm not an expert on World War II or Hitler or the Nazis, but those companies, IG Farben, the International Chemical Institute or group or whatever, ICI, I think is what
I
it
believe
is.
it's ICI. Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes from Mike Wan. He was just talking about this, to give Greg another plug. He does a great job. I love his show and I get a lot of information from it. But and I'm very transparent about that, I will say. But either way, yeah, man, those pharmaceutical companies, they're involved with the elite. They're involved with schools like Yale University, these
Yeah,
Ivy League
Stanford,
institutions.
Harvard, and sorry,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add very quickly
No,
that
go ahead.
when you bring that up, because Jacques Vallée and James Fox, when they went on Joe Rogan about 7, 8 months ago, I know it was to promote Jacques Vallée's book and James Fox's documentary, but there were a lot of times throughout that entire interview or that conversation they had where it was almost like, actually no, they would literally say, James Fox would say something like, well, okay, look, I got to be careful what I say here with what I say, because I don't know if Stanford will be okay with me going too far. And then Jacques Vallée will say, this might not be up to Harvard's liking as to what I'm about to say, so I'm going to be careful. They would throw those things in. So to support what you're saying, clearly there is some type of institution or apparatus that is overseeing the dissemination of knowledge, right? And the thing that takes me to the next sort of sub question regarding the vaccines is, do you think there's, no evidence necessarily needed, but because of how in tune with, the world and the universe you are and all that, and spiritual, do you see the vaccines as being, I'm just going to say, soul destroying, if you want to call it? The amount of stories that I've heard in the emails and the texts that people have sent to me saying, Dave, I go to work and it's not the same, or, all my family got it and now they're acting different. What's your, do you not have a perspective? Do you think there's something in there technologically on an esoteric level that we publicly don't even have the ability to notice in there that might be suppressing?
I think on a legal level, I think the insurance companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, they would be really in a great position to benefit for their evil agenda if they could patent us as human beings, right? And very well, GMOs, why they're able to patent a living organism, which is not legal, is because they're able to genetically modify it.
Right.
So if they can genetically modify us, then they might have more claim over our biological energy fields. And with all of these like biotech things that they're creating now, they might literally use us as like guinea pigs on a wheel, or a hamster wheel, where like our smartwatches are powering some kind of AI network because, our biometrics are tuned into it. And then there's like a heartbeat that this AI can be plugged into. So
right.
Yes, it fits into recreating the creation in an AI technological artificial way, whether or not the biological toxic agent that they're putting in people is poisonous or not, I don't know, but I definitely don't plan on being anywhere near it.
Fair enough.
And I definitely think that the whole graphene thing is interesting because it's allegedly the first two-dimensional material. And if we're going to be in a dimensional, universe, third dimension, I want to go up 4D, 5D. Those sound great to me. I don't want to take anything to 2D to go down, anchor me in the third dimension. So,
and if I'm not mistaken, super quickly, I just want to say, speaking of graphene, apparently there's graphene oxide in the vaccine. And if I do not want to put words in her mouth or in anyone that has told me, but Whitney Webb, apparently the main reason she got kicked from Patreon is that they told her, like, you're basically, in very fancy legal jargon, her investigation and reporting was too good. And so it was making people question getting the vaccine because she provided legitimate evidence, sources, all that indicated graphene oxide being within the vaccine. And so they had to kick her. But
yeah, well, I would tell people to check out Subscribestar. To bring Michael back into it, he has a Subscribestar, and I help him with some things here and there for his podcast that he just came out with. And
sweet.
And one of the things I noticed was that that Subscribestar is like super clear about never censoring people. So I would encourage anyone who has a Patreon I have one. I'm thinking about switching it to Subscribe Star. It's hard once you have people supporting you, because then you're like,
Yeah.
hey guys, you got to delete your credit card information and come join me over
Switch it
here.
over. Yeah. Yeah.
But, you know, I think people, if it's the right move, it's the right move. And obviously, if you're as big as Whitney Webb, you know, you get into that territory where people are afraid of what you're going to say. And like we alluded to earlier, it's getting away from them. They're not able to censor our speech. We're able to communicate with each other and learn from each other in new ways, faster ways. And yeah, that's why they need to really try to put something in our bodies, whether that's the mark of the beast, whether that's, you know, graphene, whether that's whatever it is.
Yeah.
You know, I personally think it fits in line with the 1%, you know, but my brother, my girlfriend is waiting for me.
I just wanted to say, please tell very quickly, if you could tell everyone Patreon, where they could find you, your show, all that, please.
Well, definitely check out the Patreon. Oh, excuse me. I sounded so whack. Excuse me.
No problem at all, man.
Go check me out on the Patreon, everybody. So, patreon.com/MFTIC. We have something called the Synchromistic Exploration of the Ever Expanding Now, aka Scene, where we do this research. Like, I go on road trips with my girlfriend all the time, little day trips here and there, and we go in video and research spots that seem interesting and kind of roll the dice and figure out in a kind of like synchronicity way what's relevant to the mystery. And so many cool things come up: books, places, people. So it's a fun journey, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to plug that. You know, sometimes that's weird plugging your Patreon on other people's shows, but if you don't want to support, and you want to support with just your time and your love, then listen to My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. We're on every podcast app, as far as I know, except for SoundCloud. But who the hell uses SoundCloud for podcasts? and you know, on Instagram, that's where I usually post stuff about the new episodes, and that's where I'm accessible. People have been messaging me more and more, telling me they like the show. I love that. Please send some feedback, give us some reviews. I don't have an Apple phone, so I don't really care about the iTunes reviews. I can't look at them,
right?
But they're cool. Like,
if I could say to everyone, the show's phenomenal. It's great.
Thank you. So yeah, listen to the show. We just, like I said before, we had Santos on. That's coming out the same day this episode comes out, and we talked about the electric universe a little bit too. So parallel subjects, and yeah, man, dude, this is a pleasure. People who love this show look forward to Dave joining me as a guest on My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. That's going to happen real soon, and
100%,
and a lot more in store, man. I'm excited to keep this thing going, and Alt Media United is a cooperative of podcasters who are independently united. You know, we're just kind of everybody's doing their own thing on one website. So if you like that kind of stuff, you like this show, altmediaunited.com. Pretty soon you'll find Generation Zed there, and you can find all the other cool shows there as well.
Thank you so much again, brother, and it was a blast. I'm sure the audience will love this.
Right on.
Cheers,
dude.
man.
Well, yeah, please send me all right. Thank you for listening to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, Swapcast with Generation Zed. Be sure to follow up with him. The links are in the description. And also in the description, our Patreon. For only $2, you can get over 50 bonus episodes. So please join us there. There's new ideas, new content coming every week. And we got a new show with Elemental Philosophorum with Generation Zed and yours truly. Also got Your Handbook for the Apocalypse with Michael Wan. So much in store. Can't wait for more. Thank you guys for listening to My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Support us on Rockfin. Support us on Patreon. We got book reports coming. We're going to dig into some books. It's getting colder. Less adventures, more reports. Man, some